You're listening to Cloud9, where BahaiTeachings.org interviews artists from around the globe to learn about what inspires, uplifts, and motivates them to make a positive contribution to the world. My name is toloui-wallace. Jack Lenz is a producer, composer, and musical director. For over 4 decades, Jack has been creating music with the intent of uplifting humanity. During his long career, he has composed music for motion pictures, television series, documentaries, and children's programs. He first heard about the Baha'i Faith through his university professor in the late 1960s. His professor was the renowned Saskatchewan-based artist, Otto Don Rogers. Since becoming a Baha'i, Jack has devoted his life and extensive musical career to sharing the teachings of Baha'u'llah. In this episode of Cloud9, Jack reflects on his life on the road, touring and writing Baha'i-inspired songs for bands like Jalal and Seals Crofts. He opens up about why he decided to focus on children's music and film scoring, and also reveals the universal themes he believes are crucial for any artist. Welcome, Jack, and thank you so much for joining us on Cloud9.
No, it's a pleasure, Shadi. Thank you very much.
Now, I know that you came across the faith in the late 60s through your professor in university in Saskatchewan. And I know that that was also a very interesting time in history where people were really exploring various faiths and spiritual practices. I'd love to learn more about your own spiritual journey and how you first heard about the faith and your initial impressions of the Baha'i community.
Actually, I really thought that Baha'is were artists because I found out about the Baha'i Faith in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, through a painter who was a Baha'i named Otto Rogers. And Otto was one of my first year profs because I had to take a fine art course as part of my music program at the University of Saskatchewan. And so I spent a year going to Otto's classes on sort of art and inspiration for art and the history of art. And it wasn't too long into it that I found out that he was by far the most interesting person I'd ever met. And I kept asking him about sort of where did these ideas originate about art and inspiration and unity and all of these things that seem quite universal to me, especially coming from a kind of a Christian background, narrow Christian background in a little town in Saskatchewan as a kid. And I really was attracted to that. So I started to bug him about it. And he said, well, I'm a professor and I can't really tell you what the source of my ideas.
It's a secret.
Yeah, it was a secret. And so finally he relented and invited me to come and meet his family at his home. He had 5 kids, 5 beautiful kids, and his wife, Barbara. And they had a Baha'i fireside, and that's what I went to. And it was my first Baha'i fireside, and I think the only one I needed to sort of tell me that really this was an extraordinary set of teachings and ideas and something that really resonated with me. And I basically left that house that night just outside the city of Saskatoon. He lived on a little farm. I left that night and sort of wandered around the streets of Saskatoon singing. I think the song that kept coming to me was Blackbird Singing in the Dead of Night, Take Broken Wings and Learn to Fly. And I realized that it was really, I had just been kind of set on fire by this guy.
From that one night?
Yep.
Wow.
And his family and everything. And so that really began my journey. And a few months later, I had decided I was not going to continue with school and leave for Toronto and try to make my living as a musician. I said, I called Don and told him I was leaving. And he said, well, that's too bad. He said, well, why don't I take you to the train station? Because I was taking the train to Toronto. And he just said, look, I really want to tell you that if you don't do something about the Baha'i Faith, if you don't kind of become a member, I'm afraid you'll just kind of get lost, right? And so...
quite bold.
But he could say it as only Don could say it, Otto Rogers, or Don Rogers as we called him, because he was just such a sweet guy, and such a pure-hearted soul, and a wonderful artist.
He taught the faith to a lot of Baha'is in Saskatchewan. As I've lived in Canada over the last 6-7 years, I've learned of so many people becoming Baha'is or hearing about the faith through Don Rogers.
Absolutely. And so he pulled a declaration card out of his glove compartment.
Of course he had one just sitting there.
And he said, just sign here. I left that night on the train very happy that I'd done that. And it became really, it became and becomes my life, that moment.
And so you moved to Toronto, and what happened next?
Well, I started trying to get at gigs, and I was a pianist basically, and working as a sideman and finding gigs here and there. And then I went home back to Saskatoon to see my family, and Otto and Rogers and Barbara and another couple that I met, Douglas Martin and his wife Elizabeth, said, "Oh, you should really meet these other musicians. We've got some new musicians in the community." And so I met them, and then all of a sudden they were planning this trip for us. We're all relatively new Baha'is to go across the country and play concerts for the Baha'i community. So we started this band called Jalal for the month of glory. And I basically left on this tour for almost full year in 1970. And we traveled right across Canada and stayed with Baha'i communities all across the country. We did about 300 concerts.
Wow, that's amazing.
About 1,000 young people who came to the concerts became Baha'is. And I think we probably played for, tens of thousands. They did CBC here, the national broadcaster, did a documentary about us, about our travels and stuff. And so that it was really this simple idea that became something that really turned into kind of an experiment. Because, you could always tell who the Baha'is were because the community was a little bit older across the country, and they would always be the ones standing at the back of the hall with their hands over their ears.
They weren't into the rocking out. What kind of music were you playing? What was the content of your songs? And who wrote them?
All based on the writings, but it was primarily sort of done in a prog rock kind of style.
A bit too progressive for some.
Yeah, I think there wasn't a song under 30 minutes.
Oh, really? Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
It was kind of like a Grateful Dead moment.
Yeah, bits of writings followed by long improvisations.
That's amazing.
It was certainly a great training ground for us as young musicians to be able to write music about the faith, to be able to play it every day for people. I only realized afterwards what an extraordinary experience it was because I was a relatively new Baha'i. I didn't know a lot. Anyway, we had an amazing time. And I think we ended up by playing at a Baha'i National Convention in Halifax at the end of it. And, we met all these extraordinary families across the country, and they were just incredible examples of strong family life and great people, inspiring.
How did the Baha'i community embrace you as artists?
Did they amazing.
Know how to?
For sure. They were so welcoming and so appreciative that we would come and play there. Even though it might not have been their kind of music, they loved how it affected people and how we kind of connected with all these young people that they wouldn't have had any access to, right? So it was all self-promoted. It was, the Baha'i community did what they could, and it gained momentum. And, we even had to do a tour of Quebec, and none of us spoke French.
Which was probably a big problem back then.
So it was a great experience, Shadi, and just learning how to adapt to challenging circumstances, but what an extraordinary way. And that really kind of after that band sort of kept going for about a year, and then we just weren't making any money, and I got an opportunity to work with Seals Crofts and moved to California. But then it was like watching the same kind of experiment except on a much larger scale, right?
Yeah, because they did that model in the States and all over the world.
Yes, yeah, and we would have, I remember one night at Nassau Coliseum, we played for 17,000 people, and 10,000 people stayed for the fireside.
So I heard that they would play their regular set, and then they would invite the audience to stick around for a fireside?
Every night.
Is that how it works?
Exactly. And every night, Jimmy and Dash would, and their whole, organization would pay thousands of dollars to keep the hall open for another hour. You can imagine what that would cost in terms of unions and everything, and crew. They pay for everybody so that we'd give everybody about 20 minutes before we came back out, so people could leave and not feel that they were being pressured at all. But then the people who would stay and listen, and Jimmy and Dash and I usually did the firesides.
Could you share what a fireside is?
Oh, sure. I don't even know that it was a fireside, because there was no room for questions. We just, Jimmy would talk, or Dash would talk, and then I would talk. The three of us would sort of do a few minutes each, and then we'd leave, because there was no way of interacting with that many people, And,
but you would just share a bit about, what would you share?
Well, we talked about the origin of the faith, the fact that it had a founder named Baha'u'llah, and that we would then talk about how how the faith had been established in the world, about what its promises were for the future, how these Jimmy and Dash would often talk about how their songs were inspired, and they used writings in the faith, and they made references to songs like Hummingbird and We May Never Pass This Way Again as being kind of anthems of the core inspirational teachings of the faith. But it was very common then, because they mentioned Baha'u'llah on all their records. They mentioned Baha'u'llah at these firesides. There was no fear. It was completely open, and it seemed to be almost a more receptive time in some ways. It was as I called it, the halcyon days of the 70s. Unlike the Jalal experience, where the Baha'is were the ones standing at the back with their hands over their ears, these friends would come, and they looked a bit like goats staring at thunder, only because they couldn't believe that they actually, they had 5,000 or 10,000 people in their town hearing about the Baha'i Faith. So it seemed, I'm sure, a bit overwhelming.
They're like, what are we going to do with all of this?
It's a whole new concept of follow-up.
Yeah, that sounds stressful. So then how did you get into directing and scoring? Because performing live is kind of more of an interactive approach, where you're with an audience, you're feeding off of the audience. So then how did you kind of go into I want to say behind the scenes, and start directing and scoring? The work with Seals Crofts really opened so many doors, and I got such a great training there. I had to learn. I'd learned some of this stuff. I knew how to arrange for orchestra. I knew how to write for the band that we had, but then we would get opportunities to have in places like Tanglewood and Atlanta, and we did 2 weeks on Broadway at the Uris Theater, and we'd have a big string orchestra, so I had to conduct and write arrangements. And so it was a huge experience for me in terms of early life training, early musical training, practical training. And that really kind of prepared me. And also I started really to write then, because I was writing with Jalal, but it was more ensemble writing, whereas with part of my time with Seals Crofts is every time we came off the road, then I had to do arrangements and produce demos for their publishing company called Dawnbreaker Music. So I was really schooled, first of all, through Jimmy and Dash in songwriting. You can't hang around with people like that and not get an education in greatness, right? In the study of greatness. Jimmy is probably one of our finest poets and writers ever. I don't think anybody will touch that brilliance or come near it. And then after Seals Crofts, I got to work with Kenny Loggins and Jimmy Messina, and that was another interesting and wonderful education. And then I came back to Canada because our kids were getting to a school age, and my wife didn't really want them to grow up there, which I understood, and I sacrificed and made a decision to stop touring and do all of that. But that sort of forced me into just writing, and then I started to write for
commercials. I started to write for news programs, and then I started to write for long-form series and for films, documentary features and feature films. And that kind of pushed me into I'd always been writing songs, but that really pushed me into, writing on a daily basis, and writing becoming sort of the core of what I do. I'm not sure I would have ever done it, Shadi, had I not had that experience with Seals and Crofts.
You kind of went into children's programming after. Was it during that period of time when you were scoring? Because I read a lot of your bio. A lot of it has to do with the well-being of children and catering to children. Could you share your kind of affinity with children and writing music for them?
Well, I think it really was an inspirational thing, because once you have children, you become very focused on then how can I write songs that can teach them something about these ideas, right? So the whole We Are Baha'is experience, which was the theme song for the children at the Baha'i conference in Montreal, the Baha'i Teaching Conference in 1982. That conference really was enlightening to me, because it was really the first time that the community, the National Spiritual Assembly said, we should really have some songs for children. We should write some songs and have some songs for children. And so that was really an inspiring idea, and the albums for children came out of that.
In sorrow and joy, she loved and she served like Abdul-Baha. We can be servants of the servants, we can be lovers of the lovers. As we grow, we can be the servants of God. We are Baha'is, listen Baha'i. We are Baha'is, listen Baha'i. We are Baha'is, listen Baha'i. We are Baha'is.
And then really out of that came my recognition, or my understanding that most entertainment that people make in North America, shall we say, is corrupt. Sorry to be so blunt.
I think you can say that.
Most of it has to do with violence and sex and extremes of behavior. And there's very little that's rewarding or uplifting, or where you feel, certainly there are exceptions, and I'm in no position to be critical, because I feel like that's the world, and that's what people sort of seem to expect out of television, although I think it's gotten worse. And there are less and less sort of controls. And even Abdu'l-Baha, one of the central figures of the Baha'i Faith, said that, that the world would come to a condition where people wouldn't even know right from wrong, right? So I think that started to really affect me, and I just couldn't put my heart and my soul into things that really were that bothered me, right? And so the only place I could go was children's programming, and then I started to develop.
It's like a safe place.
It's a safe place because there's no violence, and there's no sex, and there's no cruelty.
Does the simplicity of it also, do you think writing songs for children is simple, or sometimes often more complex?
I think you have to figure out, I used to work a lot with a children's performer named Rafi. And I did
Rafi, really?
I did some records.
Can you tell us who Rafi is so that I don't sound crazy?
Rafi is probably the most famous children's singer in the world. He just did all of these wonderful albums, and they were called singable songs for the very young. And he was such an example to me of how you could write songs that just were really about simple things, but they'd be memorable melodies. And he had such a warmth in his voice. He was the whole package. There was just this beautiful warmth in his voice and his sound. And he sang these songs that really felt they came from his heart. So as usual, I'm a good follower. I'm not necessarily a leader, but I felt like, boy, if I could get some songs like that for for my kids that had, Baha'i lyrics or Baha'i ideals. That would be a great thing to do. So all those early songs like We Are Baha'is and the Song of the Months and the Song of the Prophets and
I'm almost 30 and I still use the month's song when I'm at feast to figure out which feast I'm at. And some of the younger youth don't know what I'm doing. I'm like, guys, get on the train. This is going to save your life.
So I think that a lot of those came from that place, of just wanting to write singable songs and also wanting to write songs about nice subjects. And as Jimmy Seals used to always say, surely we can do better than baby. My baby left me. My baby loves me. Surely we can find something else beyond that, right?
Yeah.
I just feel like we're like, it's a challenge to artists, a challenge to songwriters. And I know that you're very engaged in this kind of work. I can tell from the music and songs you write. You want to find a way to express these ideas in melody and song, harmonic and melodic structures that still are familiar to people, but in a way are illumined by these words of God. Right? And it's interesting because there's a little book called What is Art by Tolstoy. And he says in there that all great art is both universal and inspired by a religious impulse. And he's the same guy that, recognized Baha'u'llah as a person who had the key to the world's problems in a prison cell in Akka, right? So I think that if we try to measure ourselves, and I know that artists are constantly doing that. We're constantly looking for an affirmation about the value of our work, or are we doing the right thing? Are we, you have this very good measurement in those two principles. Is it universal? In other words, is it for everybody? And is it based on a religious impulse? And the religious impulse is essentially selflessness, essentially to do good, right? To make a bond. Religion, the original word means to make a bond. And so to make a bond between people, how does art do that, right?
So you'd mentioned in a previous conversation that there were 3 themes that were universal for artists that are inherent and embedded in Baha'u'llah's teachings. You mentioned unity, beauty, and service.
Yes.
Could you elaborate on these 3?
Well, I think it's first of all, like everybody else, I struggle to understand how to do that in the world that we live in. But I think if artists recognize, first of all, that their inspiration is God. One of the great examples to me is Bach. Bach dedicated every piece of music he wrote to the glory of God. That's an astonishing fact, considering it's over 300 years ago, right? So that I think is a crucial part of that impulse, so that you're doing it when you're doing something for God, you hope you're doing it in the spirit of unity, right? In the spirit of universal love.
Yeah.
Connecting.
Like the intention.
Yeah, intention is loving. Intention is universal. The intention is trying to create this bond, this mysterious bond between God and His creation, or God and His creation. I think that's a crucial part of it. That's, I think, where the unity aspect comes in. And oftentimes music does that for people without them knowing or being able to say, oh, that's what that is.
Mm-hmm. They can't articulate it, but that's what they've experienced.
It's a sense of wonder. And I really feel that it's a sense of you're connecting people with the next world. You're connecting them with their future life.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, then you're doing what, in fact, Baha'u'llah says you should do with music. He says music is a ladder by which the soul of man can ascend to the supreme horizon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the supreme horizon, I think, is a reference to the messenger of God, which is the closest we can get to God. But the fact is, the music is like a ladder, which means it's a means of ascent to that condition or that state of being. And sometimes people describe it as, the music has created a kind of an alpha state, but it's really a state of harmony between the soul and its creator, and putting the soul on that ladder so it can climb up and maybe see beyond the daily dust, the daily cares, right?
Yeah, and preparing us for that higher nature that we will experience in the next world.
And you know what Baudelaire said? He's a very interesting essay called Théophile Gautier. And in it, he talks about the impact of art and music. And he says, such an interesting thing. He says, oftentimes when you hear something really beautiful or see something really beautiful, your heart is moved and you often come to tears or what seems like an expression of sorrow. But he says they're tears of longing. He says, because for a second or a moment or whatever that is that you experience that, he says, that splendor situated beyond the tomb. I've always loved that. So if you can create something which lifts you out of this world of dust or the dust of everyday life that settles on the soul, and you can actually see this splendor that he says is situated beyond the tomb, what we might refer to as heaven, or sometimes the Baha'is refer to it as the Abha kingdom. Such an interesting phrase. But if you can see beyond through the art for just that moment, or feel that moment of those splendors situated beyond the tomb, he says your tears actually come from what he calls an irritated melancholy, because the soul realizes that it can't hold on to that vision for more than a fleeting glimpse.
It's too beautiful.
Yeah.
So then how does expression of beauty come into this process?
Well, I think that what we don't recognize is we see beauty in the natural world. We see it in the human form. We see it in trees. We see it in plants. We see it in the oceans. We see it in all these natural forms. And people often, when they're in nature by themselves, they feel a sense of peace or a sense of awe. But that's just a reflection of the next world, which he says is the real source of beauty. So the real source of beauty is character. The real source of beauty are the attributes of God, of mercy, of justice, of kindness, of love, generosity. Those are the real source of beauty. And the greatest beauty is that beauty which then appears in the form of the messenger of God. And one of Baha'u'llah's titles is Jamal-i Mubarak, which means the blessed beauty, right? Mm-hmm. So beauty is sort of espoused as a very high aspiration for the soul. So beauty is connected to a longing for that condition of purity of the soul.
And that search for looking, I find people are often attracted to beauty because they want to experience something, and you're sharing what that experience actually is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our forms of entertainment tend to want to imply that in sort of the beauty of visual effects, or the beauty of the human figure, or the beauty of the human face, or the beauty of something that you can see with your eyes. But oftentimes the greatest beauty is the internal, the beauty of the soul, the beauty of the words of God. Like, the words of God actually have a creative power to transform human life. They have intended that from the beginning. And even in the Bible it says, and in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. So when you combine music with those words, you're playing with this and working with this thing of trying to create an amazing kind of link to the soul through these creative words, which have been with us from the very beginning. This is really what the whole kind of challenge is of the artist, is how to connect with words that actually have creative power, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, there's just instrumental music too, and that's a big part of what we consider the heritage or the beauty and the heritage of humanity as instrumental music. But the greatest power is the power of those words set to music. There's no question that to me is the standard that we will all strive for throughout humanity's coming development, coming unity, coming fruition into a golden age or a great civilization. Is the power of those words set to music that will have the most influence on human beings.
And so the last point that you'd made is how artists should be of service in bringing these words and these music to life.
Yeah, it's the key. Like if you think about the times when you've been happiest, it's when you're doing something for somebody else. The feeling of reward or joy that comes from bringing happiness to someone else, because we're social beings. We're very much beings that are, and Baha'u'llah says that in fact we're really one soul in many bodies. That's what our aspiration or our goal is for the Baha'i community, is to create that level of unity. So it to me, that's why art really needs to be seen as service. Music needs to be seen as service. It's often turns into the worship of personalities rather than the worship of the art, or the worship of the source behind the art, which is even more important. It's a tough one because people need to be paid and they need to have a profession. And
so my question was like, do we just do it for free? Is that what service means? I don't like that. I like to eat.
Of course, and I mean it in the purest sense.
I know.
But if you're writing something and you call upon your sources of inspiration. I know people talk about muses, but I've always relied on, I try to say a prayer. I remember even when I first started working with Seals and Crofts, it was so wonderful that everybody would get together, and Dash would often say, oh God, make me as a hollow reed prayer. Mm-hmm. About, and what does that prayer say, right? It says, make me as a hollow reed.
The pith of self has been blown. Yeah.
And the pith of self hath been blown, and that I may become a pure channel or a clear channel through which thy love may flow to others. That really, to me, was such a wonderful thing to experience before playing and before doing something for people. So sure, everybody needs to make money, make a living, but it's the spirit in which it's done.
The intention, again, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Very much. I think that's a big part of it,
Yes, definitely. I think my last question just is more about composition and how you evoke emotion.
Well, it's a big part of what I experience as a writer is that in the process, I try not to be too conscious. I always try to say a prayer, or I at least try to acknowledge that I'm pretty useless. So
that's a humble way to look at it.
So it would be great if you could make me useful. Right?
Yeah.
It'd be great if you could give me an idea, because in my work I need to write. It's pressure writing. I need to write. I'm compelled to write in terms of what I write for, the things that I write for. Like I just finished writing 33 songs for all the feasts and holy days as a songbook, because I've wanted to do this for some time. So I had a very specific mission, and I would, sit down and I'd read all the writings about a certain attribute of God, or I'd read about that holy day and as much I could learn about the history of it. And then I would write a song, and I've been doing it for the last year, because it's one of those things that I get inspired by, that kind of an idea. So but I also have to write about 90 minutes of music a week for the various shows that I write for. And I don't get a lot of time. And I'm also in a room with, musicians and programmers and engineers. And so you're on the hook, because if you don't get the show done, the 1 hour drama done, probably 65 cues in 3 days, then you're going to get behind and you're not going to get everything done. So that's a different form of writing. And that's what I call more reliance on craft. I do a couple of things. I get up very early every day and I play the piano. I play the piano for my disabled daughter because she doesn't speak or see. So it allows me to have a space where I can play, and where I don't have to kind of think too much. I can get my mind out of the way and just play from my heart. And there is the challenge, because part of my feeling of uselessness is that I studied classical music and I studied classical piano, but I never went as far as I should have. I went through the Toronto Conservatory method. I could have worked a lot harder. I practiced a lot when I was a kid, and then I got busy and there wasn't enough time to practice. And then I got into writing, and I would have loved to have been more developed as a musician, because, Ravel has a great quote. He says, "Art begins where technique ends." Mm. So you don't always have the fullness of training, especially if you're from Saskatchewan, from a farm.
Right.
My mom really wanted all of us to learn the piano, and I was the only one that actually stayed with it, right?
Yeah.
So I would have loved to have had more training, and I continue to train myself, and I continue to try. But your time gets more and more limited, right? And then, I'm in my 60s, so I've also got limited time that way in terms of application of these ideas and principles and muses and all the sort of mysterious things that kind of whirl around your head and your heart as you're trying to create on a daily basis. And so I have some tricks that I do. I get up early and I play, and that helps me. I also try to listen a lot to other music and other influences. I try to study greatness. I study Bach, still preludes and fugues, and Bach was doing things over 300 years ago that are still, astonishing.
Revolutionary, yeah.
I was just in Vienna for some work, and I went to visit Mozart's house, and there's a room in his house that has literally a 30-foot wall full of like glass, mm-hmm. wooden wall with glass cupboards, and it's full of all the scores that he wrote in 36 years.
My goodness. That's humbling. It's very humbling.
Oh, man.
It's kind of when you think about how much the Bob revealed in his short life.
Yes, yeah, and it's that kind of brilliance,
Yeah.
In the Baha'i teachings, it says that these great souls in the next world that are pure and detached souls, like martyrs and prophets and these great souls, he says they inspire the arts and the sciences in this world. Well, how do they do that? Well, they do it through instruments who are willing to be inspired, no matter what your capacity. Yeah. And there's this other great quote where Baha'u'llah says, "No capacity is limited when led by the Spirit of God." So despite my technical limitations, despite my musical limitations, despite my training limitations, I still feel like I can be an instrument, right? And I'll try to be that instrument for my life, because it's the thing that drives me more than anything, is how do I become that clear channel, like in that prayer where the pith of self has been blown out of the middle of the reed, and the reed is a hollow reed.
I read recently that in the writings of, I think it's Abdul-Baha or Baha'u'llah, he's talking about how musicians or the arts is translating the invisible into the visible. But you're just translating it. You're not taking something that wasn't there before. So these forces are still surrounding us, but as artists, we're channeling, like you said, these forces into making them something that's relatable for society and for humanity.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's exactly what it is. And I think of, some of our greats like Jimmy Seals and Russ Garcia was an amazing example of this too. They did exactly that. They brought the invisible into the visible, invisible realm into the visible, and they expressed it in such a way that it stays in your heart, lifts up your heart. It's one of the things that really, I think, should animate artists within the Baha'i community, but within every community. Look at the work of Andy Grammer and how inspiring those songs are. I think they're so positive, they're so uplifting often, and there's just so many people who've done that. Danny Seals, England Dan John Ford Coley, and that period of time was another group that was doing that. Yeah. I listened the other day to Walter Heath's family record with Jamie and
awesome. Yeah.
Luke Slott's record is really inspiring. The last one.
There's a new generation of musicians
whole
coming through.
Whole new group of people, and I just think it's such an amazing thing that obviously we have lots of work to do, but it's an amazing thing that we have these amazing and great and inspiring teachings to sort of try to reflect out into the world.
So we can't help but thank you for your intention and your service to the world through your art and through your skill as a musician. So Jack, I really want to thank you for your time today and sharing some of your insights and experiences and overflowing love that I felt throughout this interview for humanity and for the faith. So I really want to thank you.
Much, Shadi. And same to you. A great pleasure to get to spend some time and chat with you.
Thanks so much for listening to Cloud9. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to check out BahaiTeachings.org, where you can find more Baha'i-inspired podcasts, videos, and articles.